The elevator doors slid open on the garage, and I caught the faintest thread of perfume trailing from Mark's coat, sweet and powdery, not mine, the kind that lingers in a room long after the person leaves. His suit jacket lay across the passenger seat, a crisp hotel keycard peeking from the breast pocket like a tongue of guilt. I stood with one hand on the car door, listening to the slow drip of rain off the concrete beams, feeling that heavy quiet, knowing settle where trust used to be. Upstairs, the dishwasher hummed our daughter's sports bottle rattling against a ceramic bowl. A sound so ordinary, it felt cruel. Mark came down, whistling careless and bright, asked if I needed help with the groceries, and brushed my cheek with a kiss that smelled of mint and something floral. I slipped the keycard into my purse without looking at it again. Sometimes, the loudest confession isn't spoken at all. It's tucked into the pocket of a man who thinks you won't check. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, and if stories of quiet strength and real justice help you sleep a little easier. Tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Elena Brooks, and I have spent half my life listening to other people's children tell the truth their parents don't want to hear. I grew up in a small ranch house where my mother folded hospital corners on every bed, and my father came home with paint on his knuckles, proud of an honest day's work. When I met Mark at a charity 5K, he was the one handing out water cups and calling times the kind of man who remembered your best mile and asked about your mother by name. We married beneath a maple tree in late September, the sky clear and promising, and we moved into a modest place on a quiet street in Naperville, where the fireflies looked like fallen stars on summer nights. We built something steady, 2 salaries, 1 teenager, a mortgage we could breathe under, and holidays that tasted like sage and cinnamon. Mark's job took him across state lines most weeks, neat overnight trips that began with lists on our chalkboard, Detroit, St. Louis, Des Moines, and ended with stories about sales targets and hotel breakfasts that all tasted the same. I believed him because it was easier, because he'd always called from the road, because he never came home smelling like whiskey and strangers. Tessa was part of our circle, long before the trips got longer, the woman who could turn a church basement into a ballroom, the friend who remembered Lily's recital dates and sent Walter his favorite lemon cookies every Christmas. She and Mark laughed the way people do when they've known each other a long time, a kind of easy shorthand that never set off alarms until it did. Looking back, the shifts were gentle at first, like a picture frame moving 1 inch left every day until the nail gives. There were Saturdays when Mark swung by a client dinner and returned after midnight with the polite exhaustion of someone who's been thanked too many times. There were Sundays when Tessa texted me about a rental company running late, and then later, I'd see Mark carrying her crates inside the venue, insisting it was nothing, just helping a friend beat the clock. If you stacked these moments end to end, they wouldn't make a case file, just a string of small mercies taken for granted. I told myself to be grateful: the light on our porch, the coat draped on the banister, the laughter under our roof. I told myself that marriages are built on benefit of the doubt, even when the doubt grows teeth. The keycard appeared on a Thursday, one of those gray Illinois days that never quite wakes up. I'd left work early with a headache and decided to collect the dry cleaning before the rush, a kindness to no one but myself. The card was clean, unbent, the hotel's logo stamped in silver. The Halstead, an address downtown where neither of us had any business. By the time I reached our kitchen, the house smelled like onions and butter, Lily barefoot and singing off key as she chopped, and the ordinary warmth made the discovery feel obscene. I slipped the card into a blue pottery bowl with spare keys and loose change, a tiny island where stray things waited to be claimed. Later, washing pans, I watched Mark's eyes pass over that bowl and keep going, as if guilt makes people farsighted. I could have asked him right then, could have lifted the card and held it between us like a lit match. But something in me went quiet instead. Years of listening to teenagers tell me how adults talk over the truth taught me to wait, to watch, to let the story show itself without my prompting. After dinner, I took the dog out and walked past the neighbors' windows, the little golden rectangles where families were mending and fraying in private. I thought about my mother's hospital corners, the way she smoothed every wrinkle before bed, and wondered how many times she'd chosen silence over a question that might break the room. When I came back inside, Mark was laughing at a text thumb moving fast, face open and young for a moment in the light from his phone. That night, I folded laundry in our bedroom and started a new notebook. Nothing dramatic, just dates and details, the kind of record you keep when you can't trust your memory to protect you. I wrote down the scent in the garage, the way his coat fell across the seat, the keycard, the logo, the way he didn't see it in the bowl. I wrote down the number that texted him at 10:16 p.m., 4 digits I recognized from Tessa's floral invoices, and a note to check our calendar for next Tuesday. I told myself I was gathering my breath, not my courage, but the difference is small. When the house finally went still, I lay awake counting the hum's refrigerator heater, Mark's slow, even breathing beside me, and somewhere underneath the low, steady sound of something I could no longer ignore. In the morning, Mark kissed my forehead and said he'd be late home. A client dinner he couldn't skip, and his eyes slid toward the bowl before glancing away. I said I had a late parent meeting and smiled like the women in my office who bring casseroles when the worst happens. He buttoned his cuffs and reached for his jacket, hands moving through the pockets with easy confidence, and still, somehow, he missed it. By the time the door closed and his footsteps faded down the walk, I had already decided what I would do. I picked up the card with 2 fingers, slipped it back into my purse, and promised myself that the next time he used a key that wasn't ours, I'd be on the other side of the door. The hotel key card stayed in my purse for 3 days before I let myself touch it again. Each time I reached in for a pen or loose change, the plastic edge brushed my fingers cold and unyielding. On the 4th day, when Mark claimed another client dinner, I pressed it between my palms as if holding proof might steady my resolve. The card gleamed faintly under the kitchen light, a silver stamp of betrayal disguised as routine. I slid it back into my purse, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and told Lily I had a late conference at school. Downtown streets buzzed with headlights and restaurant chatter, the kind of noise that swallows hesitation. The Halstead rose above the block, its polished glass front glowing warm against the gray night. I walked into the lobby with steady steps, nodding at the doorman as if I belonged there. My throat tightened when the elevator doors closed, carrying me toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted. On the 12th floor, the card slipped cleanly into the slot, a soft green light blinking welcome. I opened the door to a room that smelled faintly of cologne and unfamiliar perfume. Sheets twisted on the bed, 2 glasses on the nightstand, and a scarf I didn't recognize draped carelessly over a chair. I didn't need to stay long. I pulled the door shut with careful hands, returned the keycard to my purse, and walked back into the cool night air. The city sounds were louder now, though my own steps felt muted. My chest ached with something sharp but silent, the weight of knowing pressing deeper than anger could reach. When I got home, the house smelled of tomato sauce and garlic bread. Lily was at the table with her laptop earbuds tucked in her foot, tapping to music I couldn't hear. Mark stood at the stove, stirring as if nothing had shifted in the world. He kissed my cheek like always, and I let him, though inside something was splintering. The next morning, I sat in the teacher's lounge with a paper cup of coffee, my hands wrapped too tightly around it. Carla slid into the chair beside me, her brow creased the way it always was when she sensed something wasn't right. She asked if Lily's college applications were going smoothly, and I nodded, but the word caught in my throat. The truth slipped out before I could stop it. I think Mark is lying to me. Carla stayed quiet, giving me the kind of space only a good friend knows how to give. I told her about the card, the room, the glasses on the table. She reached across and squeezed my hand. You don't have to decide what comes next today. Just breathe. That night, Mark came home later than usual. He smelled faintly of wine, his tie loosened, his smile practiced. He launched into a story about an impossible client, laughter punctuating each complaint. I watched him with a calmness that felt foreign, as though I were seeing him through glass. When he noticed my silence, his smile flickered. "Everything okay?" he asked, resting his hand on mine. "Long day," I said softly, withdrawing just enough that he noticed. He turned back to his plate, chewing slower, his jaw tightening in the way it always did when he sensed I wasn't convinced. The following weekend, Tessa hosted a dinner party for her event staff, and she invited us like always. The house was bright with candles and laughter, the kind of atmosphere she excelled at creating. Mark moved through the room with ease, greeting people, telling stories, while Tessa hovered nearby with a glass of wine. Her hand brushing his arm too easily, her laugh spilling a little too warm. I sat beside Carla, who had come with her husband, and I felt her steady gaze as my eyes tracked the space between my husband and my friend. Every touch, every look, every unspoken word added weight to the truth I already carried. At one point, Tessa leaned close to Mark, whispering something that made him grin, his dimples flashing like the man I once trusted. When her eyes met mine across the room, there was no apology, no explanation, just a calm challenge, as if daring me to speak. I turned away, my heart thudding, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Carla nudged my elbow, whispering, "You see it too?" I nodded once, the admission both painful and freeing. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching Mark undress. His shirt landed carelessly on the chair, his watch clinked against the nightstand, and he stretched as if his body carried no secrets. I wanted to ask, wanted to hold up the key card and the memory of that scarf and demand the truth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I slipped into bed, turned my back to him, and let the silence grow thick between us. The next morning, the keycard still sat in my purse, a silent witness to everything unspoken. I carried it with me to work, feeling its weight each time I shifted my bag. At lunch, Carla caught my eye and asked nothing, yet her understanding was enough. She knew what I hadn't yet said out loud. The first cracks had formed, and they weren't going to heal. By the end of the week, Mark announced another trip, his tone light, his eyes avoiding mine just a second too long. He kissed my forehead, promised to call, and rolled his suitcase out the door. I watched him go, the sound of the wheels fading down the walk, and I knew with chilling certainty that trust had already left our home long before he did. And as I stood in the stillness of the house with Lily's laughter floating faintly from her room, I realized something I could no longer push aside. Whatever truth I uncovered next would not just change my marriage, it would unravel everything I thought I knew about the life we had built. Nights turned heavy after that weekend at Tessa's house. I lay in bed listening to Mark's even breathing, while my mind spun with questions that had no place to land. Each time he rolled toward me in his sleep, his hand brushing against my arm. I went still and pretended to be asleep. The weight of secrets pressed between us louder than the hum of the ceiling fan or the occasional bark of a dog outside. I no longer searched his phone, no longer asked for explanations. I carried the silence the way one carries a bruise, hidden but sore every time it was touched. At work, my days stretched long with parent meetings and essays stacked high on my desk. But even there, his shadow followed me. Carla caught me staring at nothing more than once, and though she never pressed, she always left an extra coffee by my side. One afternoon, she leaned close while we filed student reports. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly. Her words sank into me, but I had no reply. Speaking it aloud would make it final, and I wasn't ready to hear myself admit that my marriage was built on cracks I could no longer ignore. At home, small things became unbearable reminders. Mark's cologne on the hallway mirror when he leaned in too close, adjusting his tie. The way his phone never left his pocket, not even when he sat down to dinner. His sudden temper when Lily asked about his trips, brushing her off with vague mentions of clients she had never heard of. Each time I smiled through it, masking the storm that gathered in me. Lily didn't deserve to carry suspicion, and I didn't want to plant seeds of doubt in her about her father until I was certain. So I buried my questions in quiet corners, and each day it grew heavier. One evening, after Mark left for another overnight, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, staring at the empty chair across from me. The house was too still. Lily was at a study group, the dog asleep by the window. I reached into my purse, pulled out the hotel key card, and placed it flat on the table. Its silver letters glinted faintly under the light, daring me to accept what it meant. My throat tightened as I touched the edge. The card was proof, but it was also a wound. I gathered it back into my bag before Lily came home, swallowing down the ache in my chest. The next day, Walter called. His voice carried that mix of warmth and sternness I'd come to know well. "Elena, how are you holding up?" Mark said. "You've been quiet lately." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, weighing what I could say. Walter adored his son, but he also carried a wisdom born from years of seeing through half-truths. "I'm fine. I managed, though." My voice shook more than I wanted. He paused long enough for me to know he didn't believe me, then cleared his throat. "If you ever need to talk, you know where I am." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. Even Walter sensed the change, though he didn't know its shape. Mark returned late that night, the sound of his suitcase wheels scraping against the front step. I watched from the living room as he set it by the door, loosened his tie, and kicked off his shoes with practiced ease. He smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Long day," he muttered, reaching for the remote. I nodded and folded the blanket tighter around me. We sat together on the couch, side by side, watching a show I couldn't follow. The glow from the television painted his face in shifting colors, and I wondered how many more nights I could endure pretending. The distance between us grew sharper in small, cruel ways. He began taking his calls outside, standing on the porch, even in the chill of early spring. He showered the moment he got home, as if to wash away evidence before I could notice. When I asked if he'd join me at Lily's concert, he declined with a hollow excuse about meetings. I sat in the school auditorium alone, applauding louder than anyone for my daughter, while the seat beside me remained empty. On the drive home, Lily leaned her head against the window, her voice quiet. "He doesn't come to much anymore." I kept my hands steady on the wheel, whispering, "He's busy with work." But the words cut me as soon as I said them. One rainy afternoon, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at his closet. The shirts hung neatly in rows, the ties arranged with careful precision. I touched one sleeve, the fabric smooth and cool, and felt tears sting my eyes. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the wall, and let the sobs come in silence. They weren't the dramatic cries of anger, but the softer ones that leave you hollow and trembling. When the storm inside me passed, I rose, smoothed my face in the mirror, and went back downstairs to start dinner before anyone noticed. The silence between us stretched into weeks. Mark grew sharper with his words, impatient with small mistakes, quick to turn questions back on me. If I asked where he'd been, he demanded why I didn't trust him. If I mentioned the strain between us, he accused me of overthinking. The arguments were brief, but heavy, leaving me drained long after they ended. I learned to keep my voice calm, my face neutral, because every flicker of doubt only fueled his defensiveness. Inside, though, my heart felt like glass cracking, line by line under pressure. I couldn't release. Carla noticed the change before anyone else. One evening after work, she invited me for coffee at a small cafe tucked near the library. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air, and for a moment the warmth steadied me. She reached across the table, her eyes gentle. "Elena, you don't have to tell me everything, but I can see you're hurting." My throat tightened, words failing me. I shook my head, blinking back tears, and whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can pretend." She squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of relief. When I returned home that night, Mark was already asleep, his phone charging face down on the nightstand. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. In the quiet, I admitted to myself what I had tried to deny. This wasn't a rough patch, wasn't the strain of work or stress. Something deeper was breaking, and I was standing on the edge of it. I closed my eyes, the weight of that truth pressing against me, and I knew with certainty that silence was no longer protecting me. I didn't know how or when, but the moment was coming when I would have to stop pretending. And when it did, nothing about our lives would remain the same. The morning after one of Mark's supposed trips, I found his dress shirt draped over the back of a chair in our bedroom. The faintest trace of perfume clung to the collar, floral and unfamiliar, refusing to fade even after I pressed the fabric to my nose twice, hoping I was mistaken. I folded it neatly and placed it in the hamper, though my hands trembled the entire time. The silence of the house that morning felt sharper than any accusation, cutting me open with the truth I no longer had the strength to deny. At work, I carried myself as though nothing had changed, but the weight inside me was shifting. During lunch, Carla glanced up from her sandwich and studied my face. "You look like you haven't slept," she said softly. I lowered my gaze to the table, words catching in my throat. For the first time, I let myself whisper it aloud. "He's not where he says he is." Carla's hand reached across the table, warm against mine, steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. That night, Mark returned with the same practiced ease, setting his briefcase down, loosening his tie, and asking about Lily's day as if nothing in our world was breaking apart. I studied him from across the room, noticing the way his smile came too quickly, his answers too rehearsed. "How was the client dinner?" I asked casually, keeping my voice calm. His eyes flickered just for a moment before he launched into a story so polished, it only deepened my certainty. I nodded, pretending to listen, but inside the glass finally shattered. The following weekend, I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were washed, staring at the empty chairs. My notebook lay open, pages filled with quiet notes, dates, times, places. The hotel card rested beside it like a weight I could no longer ignore. The air in the house was heavy, and when Lily came down to grab a snack, I forced a smile. I didn't want her to see the storm rising inside me, not yet. When she went back upstairs, I pressed my palms flat against the table and made a silent promise to myself, no more pretending. On Sunday afternoon, I called Daniel Harper, an old friend of Walter's who had guided families through rougher waters than mine. He invited me to his office after hours, the blinds drawn, and the desk lamp casting a soft glow. My hands shook as I slid the hotel keycard and my notes across the polished wood. He listened quietly, only nodding before speaking in a low, steady voice. "Elena, you don't have to confront him yet, but you do need to protect yourself. Start keeping records of everything, finances, schedules, anything that feels off." His calmness steadied me, though the ache in my chest deepened. When I returned home, Mark was in the living room flipping through channels, his feet stretched across the coffee table. He looked up and smiled, but I no longer saw warmth in it, only calculation. "You've been out late," he remarked, his tone light but edged. "With Carla," I replied, letting the lie slip easily, surprising even myself. His eyes narrowed for the briefest second, then he returned to the television. That moment told me everything. I wasn't the only one carrying suspicion. Days blurred into weeks, each one filled with a hollow routine. At school, I smiled for parents and encouraged students while inside, my thoughts churned with questions. At home, Mark's phone lit up with messages he never read in front of me. His trips multiplied, and his laughter with Tessa at gatherings cut deeper each time. I grew skilled at silence, at hiding my pain behind measured words. But the weight of it seeped into my bones. At night, when Mark rolled over in his sleep, I turned toward the window, staring into the dark, waiting for the strength I knew was coming. One evening, after another late return, I asked him directly, my voice quiet but steady, "Are you seeing someone else?" The room stilled the question, hanging heavier than the ticking clock on the wall. His face hardened, and without hesitation, he turned it back on me. "If you really loved me, you'd trust me." The words cut like a blade, turning my doubt into an accusation. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, rose from the couch, and walked upstairs, leaving him to his silence. That was the moment the final thread snapped. Later that night, alone in the bathroom, I looked at my reflection under the harsh light. My face was pale, my eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but beneath it all, something new had surfaced. It wasn't rage, it wasn't despair, it was resolve. For months, I had carried the pain in silence, letting it weigh me down. But now, I saw it clearly for what it was. A warning I could no longer ignore. I turned off the light, slipped quietly into bed, and lay beside the man who no longer felt like my husband. As I stared into the darkness, the thought settled deep in my chest. The time for silence was ending. Soon, I would begin to act. The quiet resolve I had felt in the bathroom mirror did not leave me. It settled into my chest like a stone, heavy but grounding, guiding my steps in ways I hadn't imagined before. The very next morning, I woke earlier than usual and sat at the dining table with my notebook. I flipped back through pages of scribbled notes, dates, unexplained absences, the perfume on his collar, the way his stories never quite matched. For the first time, I didn't see those details as scraps of hurt. I saw them as evidence, a map of his choices. When Mark left for work that day, suitcase in hand, I slipped into his office. His desk was neat, every file stacked precisely, but the top drawer told a different story. Receipts folded loosely, a hotel bill tucked between papers, and an invoice from a floral shop I knew belonged to Tessa's business. My hands shook, but I kept them steady enough to take photographs, sliding each paper back exactly where I found it. I closed the drawer, carefully aware that one wrong angle might tip him off. That evening, I called Daniel. His voice was calm as always, the kind that steadies you even when your own feels weak. I told him about the receipts, the invoices, and the hotel bill. He asked me to bring copies when I was ready, reminded me not to confront Mark too soon. "People like him," he said quietly. "They twist words until you doubt yourself. Let the proof speak louder than your voice." I hung up, feeling strangely lighter, as if the burden was shifting into something I could finally hold with both hands. At home, I practiced the art of quiet distance. I answered Mark's questions with care, never too much, never too little. When he smiled, I mirrored it just enough. When he leaned close, I steadied my breath and turned away gently, offering no spark for suspicion. Inside, I was no longer shrinking under his lies. I was waiting, watching, preparing. Even Lily noticed a change. One night at dinner, she looked between us and asked softly, "Are you two okay?" Mark rushed to answer, talking about work, stress, and travel. But I met her eyes and gave a small, reassuring nod. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. We would be okay, just not in the way Mark imagined. A week later, Carla invited me to coffee again. We sat at the same corner table, the cafe's hum, wrapping us in quiet cover. I slid my phone across to her, showing the photographs I had taken. She looked through them, her face, still her jaw tightening only once when she reached the floral invoice. "You're stronger than you think," she whispered. I shook my head, my hands cupping the mug. "I don't feel strong. I just feel tired." She placed her hand over mine, steady and warm. Strength doesn't always feel like fire. Sometimes it's just not breaking when they expect you to. Mark's lies grew bolder in the weeks that followed. He returned late one Friday, the smell of wine lingering his laugh too quick when I asked how the meeting went. "You wouldn't understand," he said with a dismissive wave. "It's just work." I nodded, hiding the photographs tucked safely away in a folder in my closet. Each time he underestimated me, the stone of resolve grew heavier, and with it, my patience. One evening, I sat with Walter on his back porch. The sun had dipped low, painting the horizon in soft orange light. He poured us both sweet tea and sighed, watching the dog chase shadows across the yard. "Mark seems distracted lately," he said carefully. My throat tightened, but I stayed silent. He glanced at me, his eyes kind but searching. "You know you don't have to carry everything alone." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I know." He didn't press, but his hand rested on mine for a moment longer than usual, and I understood he already sensed more than I was ready to share. At night, when Mark fell asleep beside me, I stayed awake, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. The lies no longer felt like daggers. They were matches, and I was quietly gathering kindling. Each detail I wrote down, each photograph I saved, was a step closer to fire. My silence was no longer weakness. It was preparation. The turning point came on a Tuesday. Mark had left for what he claimed was another overnight trip. I watched his car leave the driveway, waited until the street was quiet, then called the hotel directly. My voice was calm as I asked if a reservation had been made under his name. The receptionist confirmed without hesitation. My hand tightened around the phone, though my voice stayed steady. "Thank you," I said, hanging up. I wrote the date and time in my notebook, the ink pressing deeper into the page than usual. Proof. Not suspicion, not doubt. Proof. That night, I sat at the table alone, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I looked at the notebook, the photographs, the receipts, and the hotel confirmation. It all lay before me, neat and undeniable. For the first time in months, I breathed without that crushing weight in my chest. Mark believed he had spun the story so tightly I couldn't see through it. What he didn't realize was that I had been quietly untying the knots all along. When he returned the next evening, smiling easily as he kissed my cheek, I met his gaze longer than usual. He faltered for just a second before carrying on, his voice cheerful as he asked about dinner. I answered softly, steadying my tone. Inside, though, the decision had already been made. I would no longer allow myself to drown in silence. I would act carefully and quietly until the truth was undeniable to everyone who had ever doubted me. That night, lying awake in the dark, I whispered to myself words I had never spoken before. This isn't his story to control anymore. It's mine. The air in the room felt lighter, though Mark slept soundly beside me, unaware. I closed my eyes, not with despair, but with clarity. The first steps had been taken. What came next would no longer be about endurance. It would be about justice. And as I drifted toward sleep, the thought settled firmly inside me. The time was coming when silence would end, and the truth would not just free me, it would ruin him. The proof I had gathered was enough to burn through any lie, yet I still moved carefully. Mark's confidence made him reckless, but it also made him dangerous. Every day that passed, I felt the tension tightening, waiting for a moment when the silence would finally break. The opening came sooner than I expected. One Saturday afternoon, Lily had gone to a friend's house, and I was preparing vegetables for dinner when Mark strode in earlier than usual. He dropped his briefcase on the counter and reached for the fridge, his movements restless. "We need to talk," he said abruptly. His tone was clipped sharp enough to slice through the air. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on a towel, bracing myself. He paced once across the kitchen, then leaned against the counter with folded arms. "I'm tired of you questioning me," he said flatly. "Every late night, every trip you've been watching me like I'm on trial." My pulse steadied, not quickened. I met his eyes and answered calmly. "That's because you've been lying." The color rose in his cheeks. He opened his mouth to argue, but I placed a folder on the counter between us. Inside were the receipts, the hotel bill, the floral invoice. His eyes scanned them, and I watched the confidence drain from his face. For the first time, he stammered. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, but his voice cracked at the edges. I leaned closer, my tone steady. "You've spent months gaslighting me, Mark. I let you because I needed to be certain. Now I am. You wanted trust without truth. That isn't marriage. It's manipulation." He clenched his jaw fists, tightening at his sides, but he said nothing. The silence stretched until it filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he grabbed the folder and flung it back onto the counter. "You've been spying on me," he accused, his voice louder now, almost desperate. I didn't flinch. "I've been protecting myself." Later that night, after he stormed off to the guest room, I sat in the living room with my notebook open, the lamplight casting a soft circle across the pages. I wrote down every word, every shift in his expression, every attempt to twist blame back onto me. My hand was steady. The fear that once hollowed me out was gone, replaced with clarity. The next morning, I met Daniel at his office. He studied my notes and shook his head slowly. "He's unraveling," he said. "When men like Mark lose control of the story, they panic. That's when they make mistakes. Keep your distance, but keep documenting." His words carried weight, not warning, and I nodded, feeling the truth of them in my bones. At home, Mark avoided me for days, moving around the house with clipped words and long silences. He carried himself like a man cornered, sharp glances thrown my way, as though waiting for me to explode. Instead, I moved through my routines, calmly preparing Lily's lunches, watering the plants, grading papers at the dining table. My composure unsettled him more than any shouting ever could. One evening, while Lily was upstairs, Mark slammed a drawer shut and turned to me, his face twisted with frustration. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. I looked up from my papers and answered softly, "The truth. But I don't expect to hear it from you anymore." His mouth opened, then closed. His expression caught between anger and confusion. He left the room without another word. The first small victory came the following week. A mutual acquaintance, someone who had once defended Mark's long hours, pulled me aside after a school fundraiser. She lowered her voice and said I saw him at lunch with Tessa. They weren't acting like coworkers. My stomach tightened, but instead of breaking, I thanked her calmly. Proof was no longer just mine. His image was cracking beyond our walls. At night, when the house was still, I stood by the window and let the cool air slip through the curtains. Each lie he spun now unraveled faster, and every denial rang hollower. I no longer carried the weight alone. I was watching him collapse under it. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Mark returned from another trip this time without the careful stories or polished excuses. He dropped his suitcase by the door and announced bitterly, "If you want to leave, just say it. Stop playing these games." I rose from the couch, steady as stone. "I'm not the one playing games. You gambled our marriage for lies and you lost." His face drained the fight slipping from his shoulders. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Then he turned, walked upstairs, and shut the bedroom door. I listened to the sound of the lock clicking into place, and for the first time in months, I exhaled without trembling. That night, I didn't sleep beside him. I spread my notes receipts and photographs across the table, once more arranging them in order like a puzzle finally completed. The evidence told a story clearer than his words ever could. The man who had once demanded blind trust had nothing left to stand on. When I finally closed the folder, the air around me felt lighter, as if the house itself was shifting. The time for silence had ended. The next step would not be private anymore. It would be public, undeniable, and final. And as I sat there in the quiet glow of the lamp, I realized the truth with a calm certainty. Mark wasn't just losing me. He was about to lose everything he thought he controlled. Once the folder was complete, I no longer felt like I was trapped in his story. I was writing my own. Mark thought he still had the upper hand, but his lies had become threads I could pull until everything unraveled. The moment to act came during one of Tessa's charity galas, a night she prided herself on each year. She had invited me directly, perhaps believing I would stay home while Mark escorted her. Instead, I chose a dress I hadn't worn in years and arrived with calm steps, my folder tucked discreetly in my bag. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, the air scented with flowers I recognized from her shop. Mark stood near the stage, drink in hand, laughing too freely at Tessa's side. I watched as his hand lingered on her arm, the picture of intimacy they thought no one would dare question. My pulse steadied, not quickened. This was no longer betrayal in whispers and shadows. It was open brazen, and it demanded light. When the moment came for announcements, Tessa called Mark to the stage to thank him for endless support. The room clapped politely. I waited until the applause died, then stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished floor. Mark froze as I climbed the steps, the folder in my hand. His eyes darted, searching for a lifeline. I offered none. I placed the folder on the podium, opened it, and laid out the photographs, receipts, and hotel confirmations. My voice was calm, clear enough to carry. For months, my husband has asked for trust while spending his nights in hotel rooms that weren't booked for work. He's demanded loyalty while building a second life at the expense of his family. A hush fell over the room, the kind that presses against your ears. Tessa's smile faltered, her hand tightening on her wine glass. Mark's face drained of color, every charm stripped away. I didn't linger. I left the papers there for all to see, walked off the stage, and made my way through the silent crowd. Behind me, I heard murmurs, rising fragments of disbelief, pity, and quiet judgment. By the time I reached the doors, the whispers had grown louder than the music. At home, I sat in the quiet living room, the clock ticking softly. Mark stormed in, an hour later, his voice raised, his accusations flying. "You humiliated me," he shouted, his face red with fury. I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap. "No," I said evenly. "You humiliated yourself." I only stopped covering it up. His fists clenched, but he had no words left to fight me with. He stormed upstairs, leaving the house echoing with his defeat. The days that followed were swift. The whispers from the gala turned into phone calls, into distance from colleagues and friends who no longer offered him easy cover. His reputation at work faltered. Projects reassigned, meetings canceled. Tessa kept her shop open, but I noticed her avoiding public appearances, her name slipping from invitations where it once appeared easily. The world they built on secrecy was collapsing, and I didn't have to lift another finger. Walter called me one evening, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry, Elena. I should have seen it sooner." I held the phone close, my throat tightening, but I answered softly. "It wasn't yours to see Walter. It was his to tell the truth about, and he never did." His sigh carried the weight of a father watching his son's choices destroy what he once believed in. Mark tried again to twist the story, cornering me in the kitchen one night. His voice dropped low, desperate. "We can fix this if you just stop talking. If you say nothing else, people will forget." I turned, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm not the one who needs to speak anymore. The truth is out, and people will remember what you did long after you stop asking them to forget." He left the room with nothing more than the sound of his own frustration filling the air. Lily watched quietly through it all. I shielded her from the details, but she saw enough: the arguments, the silences, the way her father's presence dimmed in the house. One night, she sat beside me on the couch, her hand slipping into mine. "You don't look scared anymore," she whispered. I kissed her forehead, holding her close. "That's because I'm not." The house no longer felt like a prison of secrets. It was lighter open, even with the tension still circling. I walked through each room with quiet certainty, knowing that every step I took was mine again. Mark's power had been stripped not with shouting or rage, but with steady truth laid bare. As the weeks passed, his circle shrank, until even Tessa's silence spoke volumes. Invitations stopped arriving. Clients withdrew. Friends chose distance. I didn't celebrate it loudly, but each day I breathed easier, the weight of his manipulation loosening from my chest. Justice had arrived quietly, not with fire, but with the simple clarity of truth that could no longer be denied. And as I stood at the window one evening, the sunset spilling gold across the yard, I realized what still remained. Mark had lost control of the story, but I had yet to take back the rest of my life. That step was waiting steady on the horizon, and I was ready to walk toward it. The weeks after the gala passed more quietly than I expected. Mark drifted through the house like a man carrying stones in his pockets, each day heavier than the last. The phone calls stopped, the work trips vanished, and the cheerful stories he once spun fell away. Even Tessa's name seemed to dissolve from his lips, as though saying it might expose another wound he couldn't cover. The silence he left behind was not painful anymore. It was freeing. Lily and I filled that space with gentler things. We cooked simple dinners together, music playing softly in the background, her laughter echoing through the rooms that had once carried only tension. I drove her to college visits on weekends. The highway stretched before us like a promise of better days. She didn't ask many questions about her father, but every so often she would slip her hand into mine at a stoplight, a quiet signal that she saw more than she spoke. Walter came by one afternoon with a box of tools, insisting on fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen. He moved slower than he used to, but his presence steadied the house in a way I hadn't realized we needed. When he finished, he sat at the table with a glass of water, looking at me with tired eyes. I don't recognize the man my son became, he said softly. I reached across and placed my hand over his. Sometimes we don't get to choose who people become. We just choose how we carry it. He nodded, tears glinting, though he blinked them away. Daniel guided me through the final steps, separating finances, securing the house in my name, closing every door Mark once held open to control me. His voice was calm but firm when he said, "You've already won, Elena. The rest is just paperwork." I believed him. Each signature felt like another thread, cut another corner of my life returned to me. Even Carla, steady as ever, brought me coffee one morning before work and smiled knowingly. "You look lighter," she said, and she was right. My reflection no longer startled me with weariness. The lines around my eyes hadn't disappeared, but they carried strength instead of sorrow. Mark tried once more to plead his case, appearing on the doorstep one evening with words rehearsed and eyes that couldn't meet mine. He spoke of mistakes, of confusion, of wanting to make things right. I listened not with anger, but with the calm of someone who no longer needed anything from him. When he paused, searching for an opening, I answered gently, "Mark, I don't hate you, but I can't give back what you chose to throw away. This house, this life, it's not yours anymore." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he didn't argue. He turned and walked down the steps, the night air swallowing his figure as he left. The house felt different after that. Brighter, somehow. I painted the walls in the living room a soft cream, bought a second-hand chair in a color Lily picked, and filled the shelves with books that had been boxed for years. I planted rosemary and lavender by the back porch, their scent rising each evening as the sun set. Each small change stitched me back into the life I had almost lost. Through it all, I learned that revenge isn't always about shouting the truth in crowded rooms. Sometimes it's simply refusing to carry someone else's lies any longer. Justice came not from destroying him, but from refusing to let him destroy me. Looking back, I see now that the hardest part was not discovering the betrayal, but choosing to stop silencing myself. The day I laid the evidence on that stage was the day I remembered who I was. Not just a wife, not just a mother, but a woman capable of protecting her own dignity, even when the cost was high. As I sit here now, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the dog curled by my feet, I feel something I thought I'd lost forever: peace. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that settles deep in your bones and tells you that you survived what was meant to break you. Before we close, I'd love to know, when you faced betrayal or heartbreak, what helped you reclaim your strength. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like mine give you comfort, I hope you'll stay with us for the next one.